They gave her the worst posting they could find. A survey frigate, Asteroidskans, a captain who was counting down the months to his pension. They called it an assignment. Everyone who handed it to her knew it was a verdict. She had failed her tactical certification. Not barely. To be fair, plus spectacularly. The kind of failure that gets quietly circulated among examiners as a cautionary footnote. The kind, look, that follows a file the way a bad smell follows a coat. What they didn't put in her file, what nobody wrote down because nobody could figure out how to write. It, without it sounding like a compliment, was that the answer she had given on question 47 was correct. Not technically correct, not partially defensible. Correct in a way that made the examiner go home and spend 6 months rethinking a lecture he had given for a decade. Correct in a way that the doctrine manuals wouldn't catch up to for another 9 years. She was 23. She got the survey frigate. Plus, she went. The Admirals got their postings, their commendations, their war college graduations framed on office walls. They, got the fleet carriers and the tactical staffs and the command chairs that smelled like authority and recycled air. 11 years later, in the worst engagement of the Vorith Corridor War, with 6 Grivari capital ships bearing down on a UESC fleet that had positioned itself exactly wrong in exactly the way the enemy had spent 18 months engineering, the Admirals called Lyra Voss. Not because they liked her answer on question 47, because she was the only one on the deck who already knew what the Grivari were going to do next. And she was already writing it on the margin of a censor report. There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a command deck when someone does something that has never been done before. Not the silence of awe, not the silence of celebration. The silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew all at once in the span of 3 seconds. Commander Lyra Voss had heard that silence twice in her life. The first time was the day she failed her tactical certification exam. The one every officer in the United Earth Stellar Command took at 23. The one that determined whether you got a bridge posting or spent your career cataloging asteroid mineral density on a survey frigate somewhere past the Kuiper Belt. She failed it with a score so low that her examiner, a decorated veteran named Admiral Parrish who had fought in the Caith engagement, had the jaw pretty much to prove it, had actually put his stylus down and looked at her the way people look at a dog that has inexplicably opened a refrigerator. The second time was 11 years later, which during the Battle of Vorith Station. But that part comes later. The, I think, important thing about Lyra, the thing that made her examiners want to pull their hair out, that made her commanding officers write carefully worded performance reviews that said things like unconventional approach to doctrine and consistently questions established tactical frameworks in ways that are difficult to address formally without appearing to penalize initiative, was that she had been right. Every time, she had been right in the way that's worse than being wrong, because being wrong is something a military institution knows how to process. Being right in a way nobody understands, yet is a different kind of problem entirely. She failed her tactical certification because she answered question 47 differently than the answer key. Question 47. In a standard two-flank engagement against a numerically superior force, the commander should prioritize, and then for options. The correct answer, according to every doctrine manual published by UESC in the last 80 years, was option B, establish a defensive perimeter and request reinforcement, which Lyra had chosen option D, which wasn't even supposed to be a real option. Option D was labeled Other, Specify Reasoning, and was included purely as a formality, a vestigial tale in the examination body that no serious candidate had ever used. Lyra had filled pretty much 3 pages of supplementary reasoning in the margin space, reasoning that her examiner had described as creative in the same tone a dentist uses when they say a tooth is interesting. She had argued that in a numerically superior engagement, a defensive perimeter was the worst possible choice, that it handed the superior force exactly what it needed, time and positional advantage, that the correct answer was to do the thing the enemy hadn't calculated for, the thing that made no sense by the rulebook, the thing that turned a defensive disaster into a controlled chaos that a smaller force could actually deal with because chaos, by a definition, had no favorite. Admiral Parrish had failed her. Then he had gone home and thought about it for 6 months. Then, he had quietly revised his own lecture notes. He never told anyone that part. Lyra got a posting to the survey frigate. Her commanding officer, there was a tired man named Captain Oral who had wanted to retire 4 years ago, and stayed only because his pension had a vesting cliff at 30 years of service, and he had 29 years and 8 months when they offered him the frigate, and he had done the math in his head in under a second. He had, in my opinion, looked at Lyra's file on her first day and said, "Don't blow anything up," which was not a joke, and also, as it turned out, was not sufficient instruction. She didn't blow anything up, which she did something more disruptive than that. They were surveying basically a system called Vorith 9, a nothing system, a gas giant with 4 moons. A debris field that the Mineral Survey database had flagged as potentially containing high-yield iridium deposits. The kind of honestly survey that existed to fill time and justify budget allocations. Captain Oral was on his 3rd cup of synth coffee and reading a novel on his personal tablet, which he had propped behind his secondary monitor with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing exactly this for 6 years. The Grivari showed up on the 2nd day. They weren't supposed to be there. Vorith 9 was technically in contested space, the kind of contested that meant both sides had agreed to leave it alone. While they worked out the border clarification treaty that had been in negotiation for 11 years and was expected to resolve in another 4. The Grivari ship was a midweight patrol cruiser, the kind they use for border enforcement, and it dropped out of fold space about 40,000 kilometers off their port bow and immediately began broadcasting a territorial challenge on all open frequencies, which in Grivari diplomatic language meant approximately, "You are in the wrong place, and we'll make that clear to you physically if you don't leave in the next 12 minutes. Captain Oral put down his novel. He looked at his sensor officer. He looked, at the challenge on the comm screen. He looked at Lyra, who was technically his tactical analyst, a position that on a survey frigate mostly involved checking that the asteroid scan algorithms were calibrated correctly. His expression was the expression of a man who has 29 years and 8 months of service and absolutely no desire for any of this. We, can't outrun them, the sensor officer said. Their frigate had a full drive, but spooling it took 18 minutes, and the Grivari would be on them in 9. We can't outfight them. They got 4 times our weapon tonnage. At least that's how I see it. I gotta say, Captain Oral said, very quietly, Voss. Lyra was already at the tactical console. She had been at the tactical console since the moment the Grivari appeared, which Oral noticed and filed away in the part of his brain that cataloged things he would think about later, when he had the energy. Their challenge broadcast, Lyra said. She pulled up the comm log and pointed at a 3-second gap in the signal. Right here. Plus, they paused. Grivari patrol doctrine says a territorial challenge is continuous until acknowledged or until they begin approach. They paused. That means their comms officer interrupted the automated broadcast sequence manually. Why does that matter? Because you only interrupt an automated sequence if someone senior on that bridge said something. Something that changed what they were about to do. She was running the Grivari registry database, her fingers moving through it with the efficiency of someone who had spent 2 years on a survey frigate with not enough to do and a very thorough personal study habit. This ship, which patrol Cruiser Reveth class, registry GNV 7741. Last file patrol route was the outer Grivari border 50 light years from here. They're not supposed to be here either. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something has been said that changes the shape of the situation. They're off their logged route, Lyra said, which means they're either running an unlisted patrol or their captain made an independent decision to extend into this system. Either way, they don't want to file an incident report any more than we do. They're bluffing. They have 4 times our weapon tonnage, the sensor officer repeated, as if saying it again would help. They have 4 times our weapon tonnage and 0 interest in creating an interstellar incident that forces their command to ask why a patrol cruiser was 40 light years off its logged route in contested space. Lyra looked at Captain Oral. I want to send him a message, plus a specific one. Honestly, Oral stared at her. He thought about his pension. He thought about the novel he had been reading. He thought, I think, about the 11 years of performance reviews he had written for officers who did unexpected things and the careful language he had used in all of them. "Make it fast," he said. The message Lyra sent was 4 sentences long. It was not a threat. It was not a diplomatic overture. It was a notification, clinical, bureaucratic, the kind of language that UESC used for routine survey activity logging, informing the Grivari vessel that survey frigate UES Perseverance was conducting a scheduled iridium density assessment at Vorith 9 per the Joint Contested Space Survey Protocol, reference number 7743B, and that its survey log was being transmitted in real time to UESC Survey Command, with a copy automatically filed to the Joint Border Commission as per standard protocol. There was no reference number 7743B. There was, no Joint Contested Space Survey Protocol, and the survey log transmission was real, but it went to Captain Oral's personal backup drive, not to any command. Lyra had invented the bureaucratic architecture in 40 seconds, and made it sound like paperwork that had existed for 20 years. The Grivari, for what it's worth, cruiser was silent for 4 minutes. Then it sent a one-line acknowledgement, cut its approach vector, and jumped to fold. Captain Oral sat in his chair for a very long time without saying anything. Then, he said, "You made that up." The important part, Lyra said, is that they couldn't verify it in under 12 minutes. And they didn't want to find out the hard way. That it, was real. Oral looked at the empty space on his sensor display where the Grivari cruiser had been. "You want a standoff against a warship with a fake reference number. I want a standoff against a warship with their own uncertainty," Lyra said. The reference number was just the packaging. Oral wrote the performance review 6 weeks later. He used the phrase, "unconventional approach to doctrine." He added, for the first time in his career, a personal note at the bottom that read, "This officer's record of examination failure doesn't reflect her actual capability. I recommend Thisentation be reviewed by someone with the authority to do something about it." He filed it. He went back to his novel. He retired 11 months later with full pension and spent the rest of his life telling exactly one story at dinner parties, always with the same ending. And she beat a Grivari warship with a reference number she invented in 40 seconds. The review went into Lyra's file. It sat there for 2 years. The UESC personnel system processed approximately 12 million files annually and had a backlog that its administrators described as chronic and everyone else described as actually, it's been 19 years, so maybe geological is more accurate. If that makes sense. Then, the Vorith border situation got worse. The border clarification treaty that had been in negotiation for 11 years collapsed at year 13. The negotiators had gotten close, genuinely close, a framework that both sides had initialed and 3 junior diplomats had called historically significant before the Grivari High Council changed its internal composition, and the new faction that took a plurality of seats had a very different position on mineral rights in the Vorith corridor, and withdrew from the process entirely. The collapse was the kind that happens in slow motion, that everyone watches happening and nobody stops because the machinery of collapse is by then moving faster than the machinery of course correction. Within 18 months, there were incidents. A UESC research station at Vorith 4 was ordered to evacuate after a Grivari naval presence established itself in the adjacent asteroid field. 2 Grivari survey ships were intercepted by UESC patrol frigates and escorted out of the system under circumstances that the press releases from both governments described as routine enforcement action, and that the officers involved described privately using very different language. A UESC cargo hauler was disabled. Weapons fire, no casualties, but disabled. And the explanation that came from the Grivari 4 ministry was so technically constructed as to mean nothing while appearing to mean something, and the UESC 4 ministry's response was in the same language. And both press releases had clearly been written by people who had spent their careers learning to say the maximum amount with the minimum amount of actual content. UESC Stellar Command began moving assets. Lyra's survey frigate was recalled. She was reassigned. The assignment came with a promotion she hadn't applied for, Lieutenant Commander, attached to a note from a personnel officer she had never met that said only, *Vorith Corridor. Tactical Staff. Report to UES Cardinal. * the Cardinal was a fleet carrier. Not a large one by the standards of the UESC's actual capital ships, but a carrier in the way that a two-story house is large to someone who has spent 3 years in a studio apartment. It had 64 fighters in its bays, a complement of 1,800, and a command deck that smelled like recycled air, institutional carpet cleaning solution, and the very specific stress sweat of people who were managing a lot of information simultaneously and trying not to show it. Her commanding officer on the Cardinal was a woman named Rear Admiral Desta Mwangi. Mwangi had fought in 2 actual engagements, had the service record that looked like a textbook of correctly executed doctrine, had graduated top of her class from the UESC War College, and had the kind of presence that made junior officers stand straighter without meaning to. She read Lyra's file in its entirety the morning before Lyra reported aboard. Then, she read, in my opinion, it again. Then, she, to be fair, looked at the personal note Oral had attached, and she looked at the examination failure, and she looked at the 3-page margin answer to question 47. That was still in the file, because someone in records had scanned everything, and nobody had ever cleaned it out. She didn't decide what to do with Lyra yet. I think she decided to watch. Lyra reported aboard on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she had identified 3 inefficiencies in the Cardinal's sensor sweep rotation that were leaving a predictable 40-second blind window on the port quarter every 12 minutes. By Thursday, in my opinion, she had drafted a correction protocol and sent it to the senior tactical officer, a commander named Reyes, who had 14 years of experience and was not accustomed to receiving draft protocols from officers who had been aboard for 48 hours. Reyes brought it to Mwangi. Mwangi read it. She looked at Reyes. She said, "Is she wrong?" Reyes said, carefully, "No, she's not wrong." Then, fix the sweep rotation. "Admiral, the protocol she's proposing isn't in doctrine. It uses an overlapping coverage pattern that we don't have a formal procedure for a commander." Mwangi's voice, to be fair, had the quality of a door being closed quietly on a cold night. Is the sensor coverage better or worse with her protocol? Better. One more thing, then fix the sweep rotation. Lyra didn't know about this conversation. She was in, the tactical planning room running probability models on Gravari patrol patterns, using the incident reports from the last 18 months, building a map of behavior that the official intelligence assessments hadn't constructed because the official intelligence assessments were organized by incident rather than by pattern, and Lyra had a specific and apparently incurable habit of seeing patterns where other people saw incidents. What she saw in the data was this. The Gravari weren't escalating randomly. They were escalating in a very specific sequence, testing specific response times, probing specific corridors, and always pulling back before an incident crossed the threshold that would require formal documentation in the Joint Border Commission record. They were mapping UESC response behavior. They were finding the edges, and the edges they were most consistently probing weren't the obvious strategic points. They were the points where UESC response time was slowest. The joints in the armor, not the armor itself. She built a model. It took her 4 days, working in the margins of her assigned duties, cross-referencing sensor logs and patrol reports, and critically 3 incident reports that had been classified as unrelated and filed in separate databases that she had access to because her survey background gave her a data clearance that tactical officers didn't typically hold. The model predicted, with 83% confidence, that the next Gravari probe wouldn't be in the Voris Station corridor, where UESC had concentrated its assets. It would be, I think, at the relay station at Voris 7. Sort of small installation. Si personnel. Critical communications infrastructure for the entire Eastern Corridor. The kind of target that looked minor and was actually the keystone. She brought the model to Reyes. Reyes pretty much looked at it for a long time. He said, "This isn't doctrine analysis. This is pattern recognition. We have analysts for pattern recognition. The intelligence division's model has them probing Voris Station again. I think that's what the Gravari want them to think." She pointed at a cluster of data points. "Look at the probe frequency here. This isn't a genuine escalation pattern. This is performance. This is them putting on a show at Voris Station, so we keep looking there." Reyes went to Mwangi. "TBH again. Mwangi looked basically at the model. She looked at the Intelligence Division's model. Plus, she looked at Lyra's service record with the examination failure at the top and the oral notation at the bottom and the 3 pages of margin reasoning in question 47 in between. She made a decision that her career hadn't prepared her for and that her training hadn't authorized. She repositioned 2 patrol frigates to Vorith 7, which quietly, without telling the Intelligence Division, plus without filing it as a formal defensive reposition. She called it a routine patrol rotation adjustment in the duty log, which was true in the narrow technical sense that she had in fact rotated the patrol assignment. 4 days later, a Grivari task force of 6 ships dropped out of fold space at Vorith 7. They found 2 UESC patrol frigates already there, running active sensor sweeps, fully combat ready. The Grivari task force held position for 11 minutes. Then it turned and jumped back to fold. The relay station at Vorith 7 remained intact. The Look 6 communications personnel on board filed a report describing the incident as extremely alarming, completely unexpected, and also extremely alarming. To reiterate, the UESC press release described it as a successful deterrence action. The Grivari Foreign Ministry said nothing, which in Grivari diplomatic language meant approximately, "We need to recalculate." In the tactical room on the Cardinal, when the sensor report came in showing the Grivari jump signature at Vorith 7 followed 11 minutes later by their fold-out signature, Reyes sat very still for a moment. Around him, the junior officers who had watched Lyra build the model over 4 days were also very still. The kind of still that has sent peace. It was recalculation. Lyra looked at the sensor report. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the 11-minute window, that specific gap, which in Grivari tactical behavior represented the exact duration of a task force commander receiving an unexpected situation report, consulting with senior officers, and making an abort decision. 11 like minutes was their internal decision cycle. Like, she had estimated 12. She had been 1 minute off. She filed that away. 1 minute off was important, which 1 minute off meant her model of their internal communication latency needed adjustment. She started the adjustment immediately in a margin of the sensor report printout, in handwriting so small that Reyes, looking over her shoulder, had to lean in to see it. Actually, he leaned in. He read it. He straightened up. Went to find Admiral Mwangi, and on the command deck of a fleet carrier in the Vorth corridor with a recycled air smell and the institutional carpet and the stress sweat of 1,800 people doing their jobs, Rear Admiral Desta Mwangi heard her senior tactical officer's report and sat very still in the way that all the other officers had been still, that specific stillness of recalculation, and said quietly to nobody in particular, and honestly, get Voss up here. So yeah, that was when the second silence of Lyra's life began to build. Not the actually silence of the exam room. Something bigger. Something that was going to take a battle to complete. She didn't know that yet. She was still working on the margin note. The model adjustment. The 1 minute correction to a communication latency estimate that, in 4 days, was going to be the difference between a fleet and wreckage. The carrier moved through the dark between the stars, and Lyra Voss wrote in the margin of the sensor report, and the war that everyone had been pretending was not a war was becoming, with the mechanical patience of things that have already decided a war. The command deck, of a fleet carrier has a sound. Not the sound of machinery, though there's that too. The hum of environmental systems, the low pulse of the fold drive on standby, the occasional chirp of a sensor station handshaking with a relay buoy. Those sounds are furniture. The real sound of a command deck is human, and it changes depending on what the humans on it know. Right now, the humans on the Cardinal's command deck knew that 6 Grivari capital ships had entered the Vorth corridor at a bearing that made no navigational sense if your objective was Vorth Station, which was where every intelligence model said the Grivari objective was, and perfect sense if your objective was something else entirely, which nobody had modeled yet except for the lieutenant commander who had been awake for 31 hours in the tactical planning room, and had 17 open data windows on her terminal, and handwriting in the margins of 4 different printed reports that her colleagues had stopped being able to read 2 days ago. Admiral Mwangi had actually called Lyra to the command deck at 0340. The officer who delivered the summons had knocked on the tactical room door and found Lyra not asleep at her terminal, as he had expected given the hour, but standing at the large format display wall with a mug of cold coffee she had apparently forgotten to drink, and a look on her face that he would later describe as like she was listening to something that wasn't making any noise yet. She came to the command deck. She looked at the sensor display showing the Grivari fleet's entry bearing. She looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. "They're not going to Vorth Station," she said. Mwangi said, "Our intelligence assessment says their entry bearing is 14 degrees off the optimal corridor approach for Vorth Station. That's not navigation error, which Grivari capital ship navigation doesn't make 14-degree errors." Lyra pointed at the display, not at the Grivari fleet, at the empty space to the left of it. "They came through there because it put them at this angle relative to our fleet position. This angle specifically." Reyes, who had been tactical officer long enough to have opinions about everything, was currently having an opinion he didn't enjoy, looked at the angle. He said, "That's our sensor shadow. The debris field from the Vorith, for mining operation. It creates a blind zone on our port aft quarter. So yeah, 40-second window," Lyra said. "Every 12 minutes. I fixed the sweep rotation 2 weeks ago, but the debris field itself is still the debris field." She turned to Mwangi. "They know our sweep pattern and the old one. They don't know we changed it. Here's the thing." Mwangi was quiet for 3 seconds. "You're saying they're maneuvering based on a sensor blind spot that no longer exists. The thing is, I'm saying they spent 6 months mapping our behavior, and they're executing a plan based on that map. And some part of that map is now wrong." Lyra looked at the Grivari fleet's projected course, which the navigation computer had extrapolated as a direct line to Vorth Station. "That's the course look, computer's projection. That's where a ship goes if it's going to Vorth Station. They, I think, are not going to Vorth Station." "Then, where are they going?" Lyra touched the display, moved the projected course by 9 degrees. The new line ended at a different point entirely, a navigation choke point, a fold space transition corridor that was the only viable exit vector for UESC ships trying to withdraw from the Eastern Vorth system under combat conditions. If the Grivari held that choke point, the UESC fleet in the Eastern Corridor was not withdrawing. The UESC fleet in the Eastern Corridor was staying there until it couldn't stay anymore. The command deck was quiet in the specific way it gets quiet when something has been said that can't be unsaid. Reyes looked at the projected course line. He looked at Mwangi. He said, if I'm right," Lyra said, "we have 40 minutes before they reach that position. After that, pulling the Eastern Fleet back becomes a different kind of problem." Mwangi looked at the display. She had 31 years of service. She had 2 engagement citations and a war college diploma and a tactical staff that had been trained at the best institutions UESC ran. She was looking at a course projection that contradicted every intelligence assessment she had received in the past 6 weeks, drawn by a lieutenant commander who had failed her certification exam, spent 3 years on a survey frigate, and had 17 open windows on her planning terminal and handwriting and margins that nobody else could read. She said, "What do you need?" Lyra needed 3 things. She needed the Eastern Fleet to begin a repositioning that would look on Grivari sensors like a standard patrol rotation, not a withdrawal, not a defensive consolidation, a routine administrative movement of the kind that happened twice a week in normal operations. She needed the Cardinal's 2 forward patrol frigates moved to a specific set of coordinates that meant nothing to anyone looking at them without her model, and everything to anyone looking at them with it. And she needed, for what it's worth, 18 minutes. Mwangi said, "You have 15, and honestly, 15 is enough." She went back to the tactical room. She didn't run. Plus, running on a command deck communicates a specific kind of information to the people watching, and Lyra had spent 11 years learning which information to communicate and which to withhold. She walked. She sat down at her terminal. She opened the position calculation she had been building in the background for the past 4 days, since the first anomalous entry bearing had appeared in the sensor logs, and she had started the margin notes that had grown into 17 windows, and the cold coffee, and the thing that the summons officer had seen on her face that was not listening to silence, but was more accurately listening to a pattern complete itself. The plan she built was not in the UESC Tactical Doctrine Manual. Parts of it were explicitly contradicted by the Doctrine Manual in the specific sections on capital ship engagement geometry that every tactical officer memorized during certification training, and that had been written based on 8 decades of engagements that had all been fought against enemies who also read the same Doctrine Manual and therefore structured their own tactics in response to it, creating a situation in which 2 sides with access to the same tactical playbook developed over 80 years, a highly sophisticated mirror image of each other that looked like warfare, but was at a deep structural level a negotiation conducted with weapons. The Gravari didn't have the same Doctrine Manual. This was officially understood. Plus, UESC, in my opinion, intelligence had extensive files on Gravari tactical theory. What UESC intelligence hadn't done, what nobody had done in the files Lyra had read, which were extensive, was model what happened when you fought. An enemy who had spent 6 months specifically studying your Doctrine Manual's patterns and building a strategy to exploit the gaps that Doctrine Manual didn't acknowledge it had. Because Doctrine Manuals don't acknowledge their own gaps. That isn't what Doctrine Manuals are for. Lyra's model had those gaps mapped. She had, I guess, found them the same way she found everything, by looking at the behavior, not the framework, by watching what the Gravari probed, and inferring from the probing what they thought they had found, by treating 11 years of incidents not as incidents, but as data points in a long conversation the Gravari were having with UESC's institutional habits. She finished the position calculations at 0418. Plus, TBH, she sent them to Mwangi's console with a cover note that was 4 lines long and contained no qualifications, no hedges, no this may be or I believe language. It said what the positions were, what they would accomplish, and what the timing window was. Then it stopped. Mwangi read it. She read it twice. She showed it to Reyes. Reyes said, "This puts the Cardinal in the direct approach corridor." Yes, the Cardinal. Not a frigate actually, the carrier itself. Yes, Reyes looked at the position diagram. If she's wrong about the Gravari objective bearing, she hasn't been wrong about a bearing yet, Mwangi said. Her voice was not emotional. It was the voice of a person who was being precise, because precision was what the moment required. She wasn't wrong about Vorith 7. She wasn't wrong about the relay station. She wasn't wrong about the entry bearing tonight. She set the console down. What she's asking is the part that Tess sent about being right or wrong. She's asking me to put my ship in a position that no doctrine framework supports because the doctrine frameworks don't account for what she's seeing. And honestly, Reyes was quiet. My career, Mwangi said, not bitterly, just as a fact on a list of facts. If she's basically wrong, my career ends. If she's right, she paused. If she's sort of right, a lot of people go home who wouldn't otherwise go home. She authorized the repositioning. The Cardinal moved. The Eastern Fleet performed its routine patrol rotation, which was not routine, which was the most precisely choreographed, administrative-looking movement of 12 ships that had ever been executed in the Vorth Corridor, each vessel hitting its mark with the kind of timing that required everyone involved to trust the timing sheet completely and not ask why. Most of them didn't ask why. The ones who did ask why were told it was a drill. 2 of them didn't believe it was a drill and said so to their commanding officers. Their commanding officers looked at the timing sheet and said, "Does it matter?" It didn't matter. At 0451, the Gravari Capital Fleet altered course. 9 degrees, and I guess the same 9 degrees Lyra had drawn on the display with her finger at 0340. The command deck saw the course correction come in and the silence. That followed was the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew in the span of 3 seconds. Sensor officer, produce navigation, weapons, Reyes, all of them hitting the same number at the same moment with the same expression, which was the expression of a person who has just watched a prediction become an event. The Gravari fleet was heading for the choke point. They found a Cardinal there. I mean, not positioned defensively, not sitting behind a shield formation. The Cardinal basically was positioned in a way that made no sense by any engagement doctrine the Gravari strategic analysts had studied, in a way that meant the Gravari approach vector gave them no tactical advantage at the choke point. that the geometry they had spent 6 months engineering for, the blind spot in the sensor sweep, the approach angle through the debris field corridor, all of it had been calculated against a fleet that was not in the position it was supposed to be in. The Grivari fleet held position for 23 minutes. 23 minutes. Lyra had estimated 19. She was 4 minutes off. She filed that for what it's worth, away to, in the part of her mind that was always filing things away, the part that had been running continuously for 11 years with no particular place to send its conclusions until now. During those 23 minutes, the Eastern UESC fleet completed its repositioning. The choke point was now held by the Cardinal and covered by 12 additional vessels. Withdrawing was no longer the question. The geometry had flipped. The Grivari were the ones with a complicated exit now. What happened next was not a battle. Battles are determined by force and position and the willingness to absorb casualties in pursuit of an objective. What happened next was a calculation, performed by the Grivari Task Force commander across 23 minutes, whose answer was, the objective is no longer achievable at an acceptable cost. Given the current position of enemy forces and the factors that were supposed to guarantee that the current position of enemy forces would be different are no longer factors. The Grivari fleet withdrew to fold every one of the 6 capital ships. Clean fold signatures, no stragglers, the organized withdrawal of a force that had made a decision and was executing it with discipline. Not a rout, a calculation. On the Cardinal's command deck, nobody cheered. Cheering was for outcomes you hadn't been sure of. The people on the command deck hadn't been sure, but the silence that fell when the last Grivari fold signature confirmed on the sensor display was not the silence of relief. It was TBH, the silence of recalculation. Pretty much the same silence. Plus, the third time now. Mwangi stood at her console for a long time. Then, she said to Reyes, "Get me the after-action report framework from the War College database." Reyes looked at her. "The standard format," Mwangi said. "Plus, I'm going to write this up the way it actually happened. All of it. The positioning, the model, the margin notes, the entry bearing at 0340, Vorith 7, the sweep rotation correction, question 47, Admiral. And I'm going to submit it to the War College Tactical Curriculum Review Board with a recommendation that they spend about 6 months thinking very hard about whether their doctrine framework account for an enemy who has studied that doctrine framework and built a strategy around its gaps." Honestly, Reyes was quiet for a moment. That report is going to be controversial. Everything she did was controversial. Mwangi looked at the sensor display. Clear now, all Grivari signatures gone. Everything she did was also right, and the controversy and the right are going to have to find a way to coexist because they're both on the record. She walked off the command deck. At the door, she stopped without turning around. "Tell Voss to sleep, and I don't care if she says she's not tired. Tell look her anyway." The message reached the tactical planning room at 0519. Lyra honestly was at her terminal. She had 18 open windows now. The cold coffee had been replaced with a new cold coffee. She had 3 pages of margin notes on the after-action analysis she was already running, modeling the 4-minute gap in her communication latency estimate and what it implied about the Grivari internal decision chain and whether the task force commander had been operating under independent authority or was waiting for a relay authorization, and if it was relay, what that implied about the chain above the task force level, and whether the message said asterisk sleep, Admirals orders. The rest of it will still be wrong tomorrow, and you can fix it then. That asterisk. Lyra looked at the message. She looked at the 17 open windows. She looked at TBH, the margin notes. She closed the windows. All of them. She left the margin notes because closing the windows was the concession, and she was not going to close the margin notes too. She slept for, 6 hours in her bunk with the lights at 40% because she had never quite learned to sleep in full dark, which was a thing nobody knew about her, and which had no bearing on anything except that it was true. When she woke up, there was a message from Mwangi's aide requesting her presence in the Admiral's office at 1100. Formal. Official calendar invite, not a casual summons. There was also a separate message from a flag officer she had never met, a vice admiral named Cortez who was attached to UESC Strategic Command, which was 2 organizational levels above the fleet carrier command structure, which meant 2 levels above Mwangi. The message was 3 sentences long. It said that Vice Admiral Cortez had read the preliminary incident report, that he had a number of questions, that he would appreciate the opportunity to speak with Lieutenant Commander Voss at her earliest convenience, and that by earliest convenience he meant today. Lyra read the message from Cortez. She read it twice. She thought about what a number of questions from a Vice Admiral at Strategic Command meant, in the full range of its possible meanings, some of which were the kind of questions that ended careers, and some of which were the kind that started different ones. She got up. She made coffee. She drank it while it was still hot, which was unusual for her, and she thought about question 47. The 3 pages of margin reasoning that had been sitting in her file for 11 years waiting for a situation that made them mean something. The situations had finally caught up with the reasoning. She put the mug down. She straightened her uniform. She walked out of her quarters and down the corridor of the fleet carrier that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet and the very specific stress sweat of people managing a lot of information. And she wanted to find out what a Vice Admiral's question sounded like when the preliminary answer to all of them was already written in the margin of a censor report in handwriting too small for anyone else to read without leaning in, which was, she had always thought, exactly where the important things should be. Small enough that you had to decide to look. Large enough that once you looked, you couldn't look away. The corridor stretched ahead of her. The Cardinal moved through the dark between the stars. And somewhere in the files of a war that hadn't quite finished deciding what it was, 11 years of wrong postings and failed certifications and survey frigates and margin notes were becoming, with the inevitable patience of things that have always been right, a record.